Hello, my name is Blaine Bettinger, and I want to talk to you about a new third-party tool called DNAPainter. So I'm going to talk about how you use DNA painters to map your chromosomes. Now, before we talk about DNAPainter, I want to talk a little bit about chromosome mapping in general. So chromosome mapping is essentially the process of assigning a shared segment of DNA to either an ancestor or an ancestral couple. So we know we're finding lots of shared segments with our matches. And in addition to finding our genetic relatives, these segments can be used to map these segments. These segments can be used as a map to show where and which ancestors we obtained DNA segments from. So, for example here, we have Bill and Ann. Bill and Ann are second cousins, and they share 250 centimorgans of DNA. Now, second cousins will share a set of great-grandparents, as you can see in this rudimentary diagram. Now, they can tentatively assign the shared DNA they have from their shared great-grandparents. Now, the question is, do you assign it, for example, to an ancestor or an ancestral couple? And people do it differently. Now, for example, if I were Bill, then I might assign any segments I share with Anne to my grandparent here, which would be my grandmother, my mother's mother, as you can see on this chart. If I were Anne, I might assign these segments to my grandfather, my father's father, as you can see on this chart. Because we know that the segments that Bill and Anne share must have been shared by those two grandparents, and they came from a combination of the generation before, the great-grandparents. So in many of my assignments, for example, I will often assign segments to an ancestral couple rather than a single ancestor. And you can do whatever your own preference is. Now myself, I do it because often I'm at a point where it's more challenging for me to figure out whether it is the great-grandfather or the great-grandfather, for example, great-grandmother, for example, but I want to still assign it to that generation rather than to the more recent grandparent generation. Now, of course, as I say, I have tentatively here in bold and italics for a reason, because every assignment is tentative. New information can come along that can change the assignment, and as a result, we shouldn't consider assignments to be done. When we assign segment A on chromosome 1 to our great-grandfather, that's not the end of the story. We're always reviewing that in light of new matches, in light of new information. Whatever comes along, we always have to remember that every assignment is tentative. Because, for example, we make an assumption when we assign a segment of DNA. Here, for example, let's say we have Bill and Ann. Remember, they're second cousins. And if we assign that shared DNA, 250 centimorgans, to Bill and Ann, what are we assuming? We're assuming that those segments all came from their shared great-grandparents and not from some other line they may share that we don't yet know. And this happens all the time when people are working with assignments and chromosome mapping. They discover along the way that in a segment they assign to one ancestor or ancestral couple actually belonged to an entirely different one. They just didn't know it at the time. So it's always possible that you could share DNA with someone on more than just one line. It's very, very common to share DNA with someone on more than one line. It's very common to share more than one common ancestor or a couple of common ancestors with people. So this is why, for example, every one of our assignments has to be tentative. Okay, so that's just a very basic high-level overview of chromosome mapping. Now, DNAPainter is available at DNAPainter.com. It is a mapping tool that's currently in beta testing. Now, this tool was created by Johnny Pearl, and he describes himself as a web developer and family history enthusiast based in London. And so we owe a great debt to Johnny for making this tool available. This is what the front page of DNAPainter looks like. You can see here at the top, you can create an account at register, or if you already have an account, you can go ahead and sign in. Now when you hit register, it asks you for some information, namely your name and email address. You can use a unique username, and then of course you have a password. Now of course, as with any site, I highly recommend that you read the terms and conditions before you agree to use the site. Because once you click sign me up, you are agreeing to those terms and conditions. Now, I was recently having a conversation with someone about the privacy aspects of DNAPainter and chromosome mapping tools. And if you think about it, the information you're giving DNAPainter is not really something that would be highly significant or useful to someone from a privacy standpoint. Because at no point here currently are you providing any sort of raw data to DNAPainter. Okay, you aren't giving them your DNA sequence. What you're merely saying is that you share DNA with person Y and you have linked it back to ancestral couple X. So it's very similar to any other chromosome browser that if you know you share DNA with someone, you know what that DNA is, but that only you and that other person will know if that, as long as that level of privacy is maintained. So again, because DNAPainter isn't getting access to any raw data here, it's not really too much of a significant privacy concern. That being said, of course, I always encourage everyone to read the terms and conditions of any testing company, any third-party tool, to make sure that you're okay with the rights that you're giving up. Okay, so now I have here, for example, I have a profile I've created, an account I've created at DNAPainter, and again, that's free. Now what I can do is I can view my DNA profiles, or I can create an entirely new profile. Okay, we're going to click on my existing DNA profiles for now. These are ones that I have already created. So I have two I've been working with. I have one I started off playing around with, and then one I set out to do a more organized chromosome mapping with. And so now what I can do is if I click on any of these, what will happen is it will open up my map, and we'll see a picture of a map in just a moment. Okay. Now, if you don't yet have a DNA profile, you can, of course, create a new one. And I don't know if there's any limit on the number of profiles you can create. Of course, I can't imagine you wanting to have too many, but I've had 4 or 5 in my account and haven't had an issue. So you could have it for your parents, yourself, your siblings, things like that, and do chromosome mapping for each of you. Once you click on Create a New Profile, it will allow you to create a profile with whatever name and sex you decide to make. So here, for example, I have created this brand new profile for John Doe, made it for a male, and then I can just hit click and start painting. So what happens now is I have an empty DNA paint setup here where I can now paint any new matches and segments onto these chromosomes. Now you'll note I haven't shown all the chromosomes here because it would be too large, but you can see chromosomes 1 through 9. And what's interesting is, like, unlike most chromosome browsers, I'm actually seeing 2 chromosomes, 2 copies of every chromosome. You can see there is the paternal copy, which is the light blue here, and there is the maternal copy, which is the light pink or red. So we are actually going to be assigning segments to, if we can, maternal and paternal, and so that's why we have the 2 copies of the chromosomes. Remember, you always have 2 copies of every chromosome, but a traditional browser, a chromosome browser, can't tell the difference. It doesn't know what pieces are mom and which pieces are from dad. So here in this chromosome browser, of course, as we go along, our hope is we can at least assign segments as maternal or paternal, and hopefully even further back than mom and dad, maybe to grandparents and so on. So once we've done a lot of painting, what we'll do is we'll go something here, which is this empty canvas to which we can assign segments to something that might look a little bit like this. And this is the sample that DNAPainter has provided. And you can see we have these map segments of many different colors. We have this key of what they are. Okay, we're going to look a little bit more about how to go from this empty canvas to mapped segments in just a moment. Now, along the top here, you'll notice some helpful buttons that can provide information that will help you with your mapping. First and foremost, I would recommend that you check out these tabs to get up to speed about chromosome painting and the use of this tool. You can see here at the top, you have the How to Use button, and there is an enormous amount of information here about how to use DNAPainter to paint your chromosomes. Now I have just a little portion shown, but it does go on quite a bit. So definitely, before you start painting, definitely check out the How to Use button, which is right along the top on every page, and then you can go to here and get the information you need. Right next to How to Use is the Glossary button, and this is helpful for understanding some of the key terms you'll be using in your mapping. Not probably quite as essential as How to Use, but it's a nice resource if you have questions about DNA in general or anything you encounter as you are mapping using this tool. Okay? All right. Now that we have sort of a basic introduction to the DNAPainter interface, let's talk about how we go from the empty canvas we saw to having map segments. Okay? So, remember I created that John Doe account. Here is the John Doe account, and you can see right now I have 0 segments painted. That makes sense. I haven't done anything with this. So now if I want to paint segments for John Doe, and I would note that if you're going to have multiple profiles here, give them distinct names so that you don't make a mistake down the road. Now we'll see, mistakes are easy to fix, but they're easy to fix if you detect them. Okay, so if you make some mistake and you don't realize you've made it, that you can spend a lot of time with that mistake before you finally figure it out. So be sure that when you're working with these profiles, you have them well labeled with distinct and different names. You always know which profile you're working with. Okay, and double check as you're going along that when you assign segments is to the proper profile. All you do to open up a profile is click on the name, and then you will get a pop-up. And you can click on a new window. You'll go to this page in the window and click on Paint a New Match. Okay, then you'll get a pop-up that looks like this. And you can see you can paste in the segment data here for this match. Okay, now this is for one match. You aren't going to be mapping multiple people at one time. For the most part, you're going to be working with the DNA you share with one person that you can assign to one ancestor or an ancestral couple. Okay, so where do we get this data? Well, you can see here it says GEDmatch, Family Tree DNA, and 23andMe. And indeed, those are going to be the primary places currently that you're going to get segment data. And you might ask, well, how come Ancestry DNA isn't on here? Well, Ancestry DNA doesn't offer the segment data. So if there's someone you really want to map at Ancestry, you have to convince them to transfer to either Family Tree DNA or GEDmatch, for example, along with yourself, so you can get that matching segment data. Okay. All right. Now, we don't really have time to get into GEDmatch as a tool, but GEDmatch, of course, at gedmatch.com is a very powerful third-party tool, and it has an enormous database of hundreds of thousands of profiles of DNA tests that have been transferred from one of the testing companies, either 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, Family Tree DNA, MyHeritage, or Living DNA, for example. People at these testing companies have transferred their raw data here, and GEDmatch allows you to determine which segments of DNA you share with a match in the database. Here, for example, is a one-to-one comparison of second cousins. These cousins share a little bit on the lower side, 177.5 centimorgans. And once you see that, what you can do now is you can simply highlight those segments of DNA. Just highlight that whole table. You can then copy it, and you can go back here to that pop-up. So you can work in multiple windows here. I always have multiple tabs open when I'm painting matches or mapping chromosomes here. And now all I've done is I've copied this table and pasted it in right here. I don't have to worry about taking out the words. I don't have to worry about anything else. DNAPainter is going to automatically remove those. Okay. Now these are all segments, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There are 8 segments here that I'm going to map to DNA, to my chromosomes from this second cousin match. Okay, now I have, of course, at GEDmatch set the threshold at 7 centimorgans, so I'm only going to be mapping the larger segments. And additionally, DNAPainter has its own exclusion. You can see here it says excludes small segments under 7 centimorgans, and that is the default. That's going to be checked by default. So if you want to map segments smaller than that, although I certainly would strongly encourage against it, if you're going to map segments smaller than that, then you can unclick that and go forward from there, okay? Now, you can do two things from this point. You can either do what's called overlay these segments where that red arrow is, or you can hit save that match now. Now, I think of overlay as being a trial run. So when I click overlay these segments, what happens is the pop-up disappears and these segments are tentatively mapped to where they will appear if I decide to accept this mapping, okay? So you can see here, if we go back, I had 2 segments on chromosome 4, and you can see, sure enough, there they show up, those 2 segments on chromosome 4. Now, they span both copies of the chromosome because I haven't told the DNAPainter tool yet whether these are maternal or paternal matches, okay? Or segments. And so it doesn't know, it's just going to plot them on here. And now this is nice if, for example, you've already done a fair amount of mapping. This will allow you to take a look at what you're thinking about mapping before you actually do it. So here, for example, you can see I can either save these segments to the profile, see that red box there? I can either save these segments to my profile or I can clear it, all right? So if I had gone back and instead of hitting overlay these segments, I had hit save match now, what happens is, or for example, if I push save these segments to your profile, same thing will happen. I will go to this screen. Okay, this is the save match screen, meaning I have decided I'm going to save these segments into and map them onto my chromosomes. Okay, and I have a couple of options. I can either map them as I know they belong to a common ancestor, or I may map them as I'm not certain yet what ancestor they belong to, but for whatever reason, I want to get them on my chart, okay? So what you can do, for example, is you can enter in the name of your DNA match. That's that first white field there, about halfway down. And for example, I might add a lot of information here so that I can see it later on, and I'll show you exactly what I mean by that. Here I've entered, this is cousin Sally Thomas. She's a second cousin, and that is her GEDmatch number, for example. And then I might put in the notes field, shared segments copied from GEDmatch on what date, and then what our common ancestor is. It's always better to have more notes rather than fewer notes, because as time goes on, you're going to forget the assignments you make and why you make them. And I know this from experience. Okay, I've been mapping chromosomes for many years now, and when I go back to a spreadsheet or a document and I ask myself why I mapped that segment, it can take me a little while to reconstruct that information. So you don't want to have to do that. You want to have your reasoning, your thought process, everything available to you right at your fingertips. So err on the side of more information, and future you will thank you quite a bit. Okay, so that's the top of this screen. Now we can go down further down and we can say, how are we connected? All right. So here, what I've done is I have entered in an ancestral couple as the name of the shared ancestor. Okay. And again, you can decide for yourself whether it is one ancestor or multiple. Now, I can't decide here between Hiram and Sarah Williams Thomas, for example, because that's the common ancestral couple. I know the segments belong to each of their children, so I would map probably, if you're going to go to a single ancestor, I would map to Hiram and Sarah's child, who is my ancestor. But again, my preference is to do the ancestral couple, and you can do whatever your own preference is. Okay. You could also put in tentative, or you could put in another piece of information here if you think it would be beneficial. The other thing you do here is you decide whether or not this match is going to be paternal or maternal. Now, presumably, because you know on what side of your family Hiram and Sarah Williams Thomas are located, you know whether or not this is a paternal or maternal match. Here, I'm going to pick this as a paternal match. Although you don't have to pick a side, you could pick don't know, for example. And that segment would then span both chromosomes until some future point when you're able to decide whether it's maternal or paternal. You also have a whole color palette you can pick from to assign the color to this matching segment. Now here, I'm going to have Hiram and Sarah Williams Thomas as the common ancestral couple. This is a paternal match, and those segments are going to be assigned red. So when I hit done, this is what it's going to look like. I've now assigned the first segments to my John Doe account. And one of the things I really like about this tool is that it has so much information available to you at the click of a button. So for example, here I can click on one of these segments, and here, for example, I've clicked on the segment on chromosome 4, and it gives me the information for that piece of DNA. Here you can see that segment begins at 86 million, ends at 108 million, which is 16 centimorgans and 2,270 SNPs. It tells me what match that came from. Remember, I said it was Sally Thomas. And even better, it has my notes from the notes field. And so another good reason, I can have my reasoning for all my assignments right here with the click of a button, and I can say, why in the world did I assign this segment? And sure enough, I click my button, I click that segment, and my reasoning pops up. If, of course, only if I did my job in the first place and kept those good notes. Okay? And then I can click the X and it goes away, and I can go to the next segment and look at that. Right? Now, what happens if I decide that I made a mistake? Okay, this segment should not belong to Sally Thomas. This doesn't make any sense. Well, you can click the Edit Segment to change information about that segment. When you click Edit Segment, you'll have a pop-up that shows up. And now I can make changes. I can change the match name. I can change the ancestor to which it's assigned. I can change the start and stop, although in most cases you're not going to be changing those. I can change the notes. Another thing I can do is I can change my confidence level. Okay, I can say it's very certain, or I can make other confidence level changes. I haven't changed the confidence levels much on the segments I've assigned because I consider the notes field to essentially have my reasoning, and therefore I can decide for myself on the go how confident I am in an assignment. Another thing you can do is you can view all the segments you match with this person. So rather than me editing one segment at a time, I can change all of them. Now this might be a case where, remember I said before, you might make mistakes as you're mapping. You may say, for example, I don't share Hiram and Sarah Williams Thomas with Sally Thomas. I share Sam Thomas with that cousin, okay? And rather than going one by one and hunting and pecking for those segments, you can change all of them. So you hit View All Segments for Sally Thomas, and now you have a pop-up here where you can either delete all those segments or you can edit them. And another thing I really like about this is it condenses the view. So now I'm seeing just the chromosomes where I share DNA with Sally Thomas, and they're all highlighted there. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 segments that I share with Sally Thomas. Okay, in a total of 174 centimorgans. So now what I can do is I can edit that match, okay, which will take me to yet another screen where I can edit. I can move those segments to another group, I can change a confidence level, and I can, of course, make those changes and then save that, okay, as a group. Or I could hit Delete Match, for example, which would get rid of all of those segments, and then I could remap them rather than just changing the information, just kind of map them again, making sure I enter in the right information this time, okay? Now another thing you can do is you can click on an individual chromosome to get detail about that chromosome. So here, for example, I've clicked on chromosome 9, and I have a pop-up now of information about that chromosome. I have all the segments I've mapped. Looks like I've mapped a total of 4 segments, 3 paternal and 1 maternal. Another thing you'll see here is this little shaded bar. And when you click on that shaded bar, now this won't be on all chromosomes, and it's on different locations in other different locations, but it actually shows you the common pile-up areas on these chromosomes, okay? So when I click on that, you'll see that this is known as a pileup region, and it gives you a link to read more information. Now we know there are regions of the chromosomes where you tend to share DNA with more people than you otherwise reasonably should based on the size of the databases. Okay, and that suggests that these segments are more common within the population. Okay, and we want to be aware of this because we need to be very careful about making assumptions based on these pileup areas without at least considering the fact that it could be a pileup. Okay. Now here is a more detailed map of this of one of my chromosome maps, for example. So I have a lot more segments here mapped than on John Doe's profile. And one thing you can do here is you can click on individual ancestors to see the segments that have been identified or mapped to that ancestor. Now this is a little bit different view than the match view or the segment view where we would see all the segments that were assigned to Sally Thomas or shared in common with Sally Thomas because, for example, if I click on Theodore and Goldiah here, it could be that I have 5 matches that I've assigned their segments to Theodore and Goldiah. So it'll show you all the segments. All right, when I click on their names, you can see it shows you what matches you have used to assign segments to these shared ancestors. And I can decide, well, you know what, I shouldn't have done that. I have no idea why I did that. You can click on one of those names to edit those matches. So for example, let's say I click on one of them, the N there. And when I do that, I can see the segments that were mapped by that person versus the segments that were mapped by the other match. You can see the segments that were mapped to the individual I've clicked, those are shaded. Okay. On the other hand, the segments for the person I didn't click are green. So any changes I make to the shaded ones are only going to be to the shaded segments, not to the green segments. So there are so many different ways to edit information, which is really important because as you're going along, you're going to find that you do make mistakes with mapping. So it's another reason to have good notes and to be able to change things as you're going along. Okay. Now another thing you can do, if we go back to our main screen, is you can view, for example, all of your paternal or maternal maps. So here, for example, I can click on paternal, and now I have all of the segments of DNA I've mapped on my paternal side of the family. And you can see here what's interesting is also at the top I have the number of segments I've painted and the total percentage. So on my paternal side here, I've mapped about 56% of my paternal DNA, which is a total of 117 centimorgans. Okay. Now I can go back and do the same thing for the maternal side. When I click maternal, I get a total of 39 centimorgans, and I'm sorry, 39%. And a total of 53 segments that are painted. So obviously, I've done a lot more so far on my paternal side than my maternal, and I need to get going on that. Okay, so you can see here, this is just a comparison of 56% paternal, 39% maternal. Okay, and so I can keep working on this, and I can keep assigning new segments with the ultimate goal of ultimately getting to 100%. And then when you're at 100%, that's not to say your job is done. Because maybe I could map 100% to my 4 grandparents, but then I want to go back a generation and then another generation, and the segments will get smaller and smaller, and I'll still have a lot mapped, but I'll be working on getting it further back in time. Another important consideration is to save your work. You don't want to do all of this mapping only to learn at some future point that you forgot your password or you can't access your data, you've lost your email address, anything like that. Okay, so one thing we can do is we can view and back up our data right here with that button. So here I am back to John Doe's map. He hasn't been working too hard on this yet, but we can view and map the data. When we click on that, we get a pop-up, and it has all of our assignments. It has the chromosome number, the start and stop, the size, the SNPs, what match it was, the confidence level, the group, the side, and the notes. Okay, and another thing is I can now download that as a .csv file. And sure enough, when I download it, it looks like this. And you can see now I have all of that information saved on my computer. And if I ever have to, say, move it to a new mapping tool, or if I want to use it for something else, then I can always do that. Okay. Now another thing you can do here is you can also duplicate. So you see the bottom there. One thing I was thinking about is I could download my data and then upload it as a new profile, but I don't need to do that. I can just duplicate one profile. Let's say I want to play around with a profile, create sort of a sandbox where I can play with a profile and make some tentative assignments that I'm a little too worried about messing up my organized profile with. I can just hit duplicate and it will essentially clone this in a new profile, and then I can play around with it there. Now when you do that, of course, make sure you give it a name that will make sure that you don't confuse those in the future. Okay, so save this file locally. That way make multiple copies. Keep one on your desktop, make a remote copy somewhere else so that you'll always have a copy of all of your information, and update this copy. Right, when you make new assignments, make sure you update your new assignments. Now, another thing you can do is you can actually share your work. Let's say you're collaborating with someone about segments. Now, you do need to, of course, respect people's privacy. We don't share information about matches unless we have their permission. So you want to be careful about who you share this information with. But you can see this does have a share button. So you can share this privately with another individual, again, keeping in mind that we want to be careful about privacy restrictions. So here, for example, I have a profile where I've clicked this, and the profile is currently private, and then I can click that switch, and when I do that, when I click on the private button there, I turn that into a shared profile, meaning someone with that link, that's right there, I can copy and paste that link. Someone with that link can now view my map in read-only mode. Now that's important, right? You want people to read this in read-only mode. You don't want them to go in and make changes. If you want them to make changes, you could say create a duplicate account, a duplicate profile, and give them access to that profile by giving them your new name and password, for example. That might be one way to do that. Again, being very careful with privacy restrictions and sharing your information. But you can view this, you can send this to someone who can view it in the read-only mode. And again, what's nice about this is you're not giving them any access to raw data. If someone gets this link, there's nothing they can do to get the access to the raw data. Okay, so that's a handy feature. Now, of course, if you share it with someone that's on the map and they share DNA with you, well, of course, they already know that through whatever mechanism you know that. So again, you're not giving them a great deal of information. Another thing you can do with this is you can detect and then correct errors you make in your mapping. And there is no question you will be making errors in your mapping. I, for example, was mapping, and what I realized was I had mapped paternal segments on chromosome 7. And I actually ended up triple mapping onto chromosome 7. I mapped segments to 3 different grandparents on chromosome 7. Now, in one location, which is the important key term there. You can't get DNA from 3 grandparents at one location. I can only get DNA from 1 paternal grandparent at one location and 1 maternal grandparent at one location. Of course, I get a mixture of all 4 of them along all of my chromosomes, but we're talking about one location on chromosome 7. And you can see where the box is there. What has happened here is I have mapped this to 2 different paternal grandparents, my paternal grandmother and my paternal grandfather. And so that can't be. I can only have DNA from 1 grandparent at that location. So I've made a mistake. Now, it's interesting here because I have this long blue segment I share with a close relative. It's probably the small segment that's the issue. Not a guarantee, particularly if this is due to user entering entry errors, for example. But chances are it's going to be the small segment. And sure enough, when I go and look at this, what I discover is that small segment is, in fact, the issue. And now I can click on that small segment, and I can then make whatever changes necessary to fix that mistake. Okay. Now, there are some other DNAPainter tools that I have found to be very useful. The first is the Shared Centimorgan tool. It's actually an interactive version of the Shared Centimorgan project. Okay, so we're going back to that top bar again. We looked at how to use, we looked at the profiles, we looked at the glossary. Now we're going to look at the tools option. And you can see here we have the Shared Centimorgan tool. When we click on that, what happens is we're going to get an interactive version of the Shared Centimorgan project. Now, if you're not familiar with the Shared Centimorgan project, this is a project I've worked on where I've collected data from thousands of genealogists who have submitted information about known relationships. So for example, someone who has a known first cousin relationship and has tested at one of the testing companies themselves in the first cousin, they're going to get a result back of say 800 centimorgans or 750 centimorgans or 1,000 centimorgans. And so what they do is they say to me, they have I have a portal where they can say, yep, these are first cousins at Family Tree DNA and they share 1,000 centimorgans. Okay, and then I have a range. So for first cousin, I may have 2,000 entries, and then I'll have a range. So here, for example, is aunt and uncle. The average among the thousands of submissions for aunt and uncle that I've received has been 1,750, with a range from a low of 1,349 to a high of 2,175. Okay. So now what you can do is you can use the interactive tool to discover which relationships a shared amount of DNA fits into. Let's say you share 400 centimorgans with someone, for example. Well, what you would normally do is you would go back to this chart and you would say into which of these boxes does 400 centimorgans potentially fall. What's nice about this tool is it does all of that work for you. Okay. So what you'll do is you'll come in here and you'll enter in whatever amount of DNA you found. So, for example, I do this for all of my matches because I don't rely on the company comparisons. I instead rely on the charts. I don't rely on the company estimating what the relationship is. I'm going to use the charts instead. Okay, and so I come along and I enter in 250 centimorgans. And what will happen is the chart will change as soon as I enter that from this, okay, where everything's highlighted, to this. Now, these are the relationships into which 250 centimorgans might fall. Okay, so presumably 250 centimorgans is probably one of these relationships, assuming that the relationship doesn't include multiple relations. Okay, well, maybe you're a first cousin once removed and a third cousin, or maybe you're a fourth cousin 5 times or something like that. Okay. So these are just clues. Now what I would normally do is I would take the relationship where the average is closest to that value, 250 centimorgans, and that's where I would start. So somewhere around, say, second cousin or first cousin twice removed, somewhere in that region, those are going to be the prime relationships I start looking after, half first cousin once removed. But remember, it could be any of these relationships potentially. All right. The other nice thing this does for me is it converts from percentages to centimorgans and back and forth. Now, if you work at 23andMe, you know 23andMe provides percentages. I'm not a huge fan of percentages. I know some people are, but I prefer to think in centimorgans. It's just the way I always have. So I have a hard time converting back and forth. So what I can do now is I can enter in 250 and I can show percentage, and it will convert that to a shared percentage, which is very handy. I can also go back and forth. I can enter in the total shared in percents from 23andMe, and that will tell me the amount in centimorgans. Okay. The other thing you can do is you can share the chart you've created. Here, for example, it says click here for a shareable link to the centimorgan amount above. And sure enough, when you click on that, what happens is you get up at the top here, you can see it says DNAPainter.com/tools/sharedcm/250. So now I've created a link where I can share that with someone else, and I can say, oh yeah, here, cousin Bob, these are the relationships that 250 fits into. Here's a chart you can look at quickly and easily. Right up here at the top, you have that link, and you can cut and paste that, and that's fully shareable. So that's very, very convenient. The other thing you can do is you can actually edit the chart. So here, for example, this is a beta version of the shared centimorgan tool, and when you click on that, you're going to get a version that you can edit. So let's say we enter in, for example, rather than our 250 we entered last time, we enter in 1700. And when we do that, we're going to get a limited number of entries, of course, because that's a very close relationship. Okay. So when we do that, you can see these are the various relationships, and now I can edit the names here. I can edit where it says grandparent, aunt, uncle, half sibling, so on. I can put in, for example, people's names. Maybe I can put in Joseph Reynolds, Mary Reynolds, Nancy Reynolds, and so on and so forth. I can edit this. I can maybe make notes to someone when I share it. And so what's nice about this is when I'm done, you can download it as an image to keep a copy of that chart that you can then share with another individual. Okay, so that could be really handy if you want to help someone understand potentially what this chart means or how to interpret it and go forward from there. So there are a ton of options you can do. Now, again, this is just a very basic introduction to DNAPainter, but hopefully after viewing this, you have a little bit more understanding of the tool and how to use it. And again, I'd like to thank Johnny Pearl for making this resource available, and I hope you take advantage of it, and I hope to hear about some successful stories you've had using the tool. Good luck.